I am honored to invite another distinguished leader, Dr. Bibek, Debroy, Chairman, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Government of India, to deliver the keynote address on the government's strategic role in Udyami Bharat, empowering entrepreneurs, fostering innovation, and building self-reliance. May I request Dr. Bibek Debroy to kindly join us on stage. And ladies and gentlemen, can we please welcome him with a big thunderous round of applause.
Thank you, Dun & Bradstreet, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be at a Dun & Bradstreet event, although it's been some years since I was last at any such event. I'm going to talk a little bit about the economy, and then in the second half I'm going to focus a little bit of MSMEs. The trouble, of course, by the way, is that working? Otherwise I'll take my watch out. Is that timer working? Yes, sir. Yeah, okay. I have a disadvantage because I just turned up and I don't want to contradict what my dear friend Amitabh Kant might have said. Let's talk about the economy first. There are different ways to look at the economy, and much of what I'm going to say you're already familiar with. Compared to many countries in the world, India is doing reasonably well on macro fundamentals, whether that is the real rate of growth, whether it is inflation, or any other parameter. But the aspiration that India has, the aspiration that India's citizens have, is much higher. In the next 5 years, and the next 5 years are important because in the next 5 years, we will become the third largest economy in the world in terms of official exchange rates, not merely purchasing power parity exchange rates. In the next 5 years, this government which has just come in will be there till 2029. Shortly after that will be 2030, which is the terminal date for the Sustainable Development Goals, which are important because growth is not just a number just for the heck of it being a number. It is important because it has implications in terms of human development. To get back to what I was saying, in the next 5 years, there is consensus that India is on a growth trend. I'm not talking about this particular year, but generally India is on a growth trend of something like 7% real rate of growth. If it is someone outside the government, that person will say 6.5. If it is someone within the government, that person will say 7.5. And all forecasts are subject to some uncertainty, but generally 6.5 to 7.5%. But given what has been said about aspirations, 6.5 to 7.5% is simply not good enough. We ought to be doing better than that. How much better? In passing, each one of you can sit down with a calculator, or these days a mobile, have your own assumptions about the real rate of growth, have your own assumptions about inflation, which is easier to pin down because the RBI has a band, have your own assumptions about the exchange rate, and figure out what India's aggregate economic size is going to be in 2047, which is the terminal date for Amrit Kal, and figure out what India's per capita income is going to be. And if you do that, and you are conservative about the real rate of growth, you will find that India's per capita income, if you are conservative, is going to be about 10,000 US dollars. So it will fall short of what technically is called high income today. But 10,000 US dollars will mean there will be a remarkable transformation in the nature of the Indian economy, socio-economic churn and all of that. And the aggregate size of the economy, again conservatively, will be something like 20 trillion. If you are a bit more optimistic, both of those numbers will be higher. And these are numbers in today's dollars, not in current dollars. If I am going to talk about the rate of growth, there are different ways to slice it. One way to slice it is in terms of the four major growth drivers of any economy, which is consumption, investment, government expenditure and net exports. At least in the immediate foreseeable future, given the uncertainty in the world, given geographical tensions, net exports as a major driver does not seem to be a very promising engine of growth. Had the world been more benign, the aspirational rate of growth might have been 9%. But given what I have just said about the external world, the aspirational rate of growth that we are talking about is probably not 9%, it is probably about 8.5%, 8%, 8.5%. So we are talking about jacking up the rate of growth from 7.5% to 8.5%, which is where the reforms come in. And again, there are different ways to slice it. If net exports are not going to be a major driver, then the major drivers will have to be consumption, investment expenditure and government expenditure. As you know only too well, government, at least the union government, has been spending a lot, particularly post-COVID, through capital expenditure. But there are limits as to the extent to which that can be done, because after all, fiscal consolidation is important, deficit reduction is important, and therefore the focus shifts to the extent to which consumption expenditure and private investment expenditure are recovering. There is always a time lag with data, so we can quibble and argue. I personally think that both of those are showing signs of recovery. Yet another way to slice it is in terms of the standard national income accounting categories of primary sector, secondary sector and tertiary sector. And the final way to slice it is in terms of the states, because what happens to all India is an aggregate of the GSDP rates of growth for individual states. Depending on the year, 95% to 97% is an aggregate of what happens at the level of the states. Yes, there is defense, there is railways, but the bulk of it is the states. So if India has to grow at 8 and 8.5%, many of the states need to do better than they are doing today. When we talk about reforms and we are heading towards the next budget, many of you will have expectations about the union budget. There is a lot of hype and a lot of media attention around the union budget. There is virtually zero attention and zero media hype about the state budgets. About 2/3 of public expenditure happens at the level of the states. If one is going to list out the reforms, prominent in those reforms will be what economists call factor markets, which is not just capital, but land and labor. Labor is in the concurrent list, land is entirely in the state list. So, to rephrase the question, whether we reach that aspirational rate of growth or not is really a function of how the states begin to perform. When I look at the budget, I said there is a lot of hype around the budget. The budget happens on a single day of the year. It is not as if on the other days of the year the government ceases to function. Many policy announcements can happen and will happen outside the budget, particularly if they concern legislature, because several changes will require legislative changes. The budget, technically speaking, is just an annual statement of the union government's receipts and expenditure. On the receipts side, there is the non-tax revenue. You can look at it in terms of privatization or the monetization pipeline, and there is the tax side. I do not have the time to get into the details of GST, but GST is largely determined by the GST Council, not so much by the union government. And we have the direct taxes. On direct taxes, whether it is the personal income tax side or the corporate tax side, the bottom line is an elimination of exemptions which is required for a simplification of direct taxes. On the expenditure side, most of you will probably know that much of revenue expenditure is exogenously determined and fixed in the short run. Having said this, let me quickly turn to MSME. I know you have been talking about MSME. I know you expect me to say things about MSME. The honest to God answer is I do not know what MSME means. As everyone present here knows, it is not mandatory for me to get myself registered under any form of legislation to be MSME. The last MSME census was years ago. So, whenever I see figures saying the MSME contributes X percentage to output, Y percentage to manufacturing value, Z percentage to exports, I am very skeptical, because these numbers are based on a very sophisticated econometric technique which I am sure you have not heard of, but which works in government, which is called the ceiling method, which means you look at the ceiling and think of a figure. Perhaps MSME contributes much more, but we do not know, because as I said 97% is not registered. Not under the Companies Act, not even under a Proprietorship Act. We do not know whether it exists or it does not exist. So, the biggest problem I am flagging before you, and it is an item that needs to be sorted out by government at some point, is some kind of legal identity for MSME. We all know about Aadhaar. I do not have the time to get into various refinements that are required in Aadhaar, but MSME, I need some kind of identity. Perhaps it is the GSTN number, I cannot think of anything better. Failing this, as I said, I do not know what is a MSME. There are a large number of MSME enterprises. And however unpalatable it may sound, historically, Many of them have survived on the basis of not paying taxes or evading taxes. That cannot be an engine for competitiveness. The day where competitiveness was based on me being outside the GST net, that's history. GST is work in progress, and all of us are familiar with our purchases of various consumer durables when the shopkeeper would say, "Kacha raseed chahiye?" Thankfully, it seems to me that it is easing off. When we think of MSME, there are large numbers that float around in lakhs. There are those, and there are 25,000 probably larger ones. The average MSME, I am using the word S also, employs 1.5 persons, including the service sector, of course. With 1.5, what do you expect the person to do in terms of marketing? What do you expect the person to do in terms of technology upgradation? Most of the time, all the person is doing is to negotiate the various regulatory hurdles that governments, union government and state governments place in its way. Admittedly, there is the ease of doing business, which has made life easier. But the moot question is, what is the competitiveness that drives MSME? Is it that it provides inputs to the large scale sector? Or are we talking here about the 25,000? I know you've been talking about credit. What percentage of MSMEs resorts to the official credit market? Perhaps you will have spoken about insolvency. What percentage of MSMEs actually can use the insolvency and bankruptcy code? So there is a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in MSMEs, which is the reason I am very hesitant to generalize on MSMEs. Thank you very much.